Verbs! The second part. Okay, guys, so we've covered the first three categories in this list here. We've covered number, we've covered person, we've covered tense. Today, we're going to be talking about mood and aspect. So there's actually lots of different moods, but the ones that show up the most in English are indicative, imperative, subjunctive, and conditional. So indicative is the one that we use almost all the time. I mean, we use these all the time pretty much, but indicative is something that is a statement of fact, and it's an assertion that has or has not definitely happened. So for example, I walked the dog. Imperative, again, you've probably heard of this one, but imperative has to do with an order or command. So think imperative, emperor, right? Someone who's issuing a command. Usually the subject is an understood you as opposed to having a particular pronoun before it. And an example would be something like right, which I say to you all the time. So the next two, the subjunctive and the conditional, are a little bit confusing to separate from each other. And that's because the subjunctive, we don't use it very often in modern English, and so it often, when it is used, it might sound like it is a conditional. But the subjunctive is used to designate hypothetical situations or situations that are contrary to fact. So the usage that we would think of, or that most people could think of in relation to this, is when you say, if I were. And so this is different from the conditional in that the conditional is related to the modals, right? It discusses something related to possibility, to chance. And in essence, the thing about the conditional is that it's suggesting an outcome based on something else that isn't contrary to fact or hypothetical. Now, this next aspect of grammar is my favorite. Yep, you guessed it. It's aspect. Aspect. Now, aspect is a way that we relate events in time. And so what I've done here is I've given you some examples that include the different aspects that might be present in a sentence. And so, for example, we have, I was cooking dinner when the phone rang. Okay, so the was cooking would be an example of the progressive aspect, okay? So you were, are, will be in the process of completing an action at some point. Now, don't get confused because sometimes people will refer to this as the progressive tense, which technically it is, but when we're thinking about aspect, it's actually saying how the tense is functioning. It's not the tense itself. Next up, we have I have slept the entire day away. So in this case, the I have slept is an example of the perfect aspect. You have, had, will have completed an action at some point. So notice that when we have the to be verb, we are usually going to be in the progressive aspect. And if we have to have, then we are in the perfect aspect. Now, this last one, I have been dieting lately, is an example of what we would call the perfect progressive aspect, okay? So as you can see in this example, we have both to have and to be helping the verb, right? So if we know that the verb phrase, I diet, is being helped by both to be and to have, there's a very good chance that we're going to be in the perfect progressive aspect, which is an example, or which is an aspect that indicates that something started at one point and continues or continued to another point in time. You know, a lot of people ask me if I'm a Republican or a Democrat, but I prefer to think of myself as a perfect progressive. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So this next part is just kind of a reminder of what we've been learning about verbs so far. So what you'll see here is you'll see the infinitive, you'll see the present participle, the past participle, and the conjugations that include the future, as well as the past and the third person S form. So these are to be and to have. And as I said, to be and to have are going to be the verbs that allow you to figure out what aspect is going on in the sentence. I forgot to mention that there is sort of one more aspect, but it's not really an aspect, it's kind of just the regular indicative with none of these helping verbs, and that would just be the simple aspect. So the last thing that I want to stress to you is that not all forms of these verbs are going to be useful for creating the aspects, okay? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second when I kind of break down into a little schematic how these tenses relate to the aspects themselves. So here they are. This is essentially the least you need to know, though you obviously have to understand how to read this. And so I'm just going to explain that a little bit. So what I've done is when you have any aspect, there's parts of it that must be there and there's parts that could be there. And so the could be there would be will, okay? So will as the modal that's indicating a future aspect, or a future tense with a particular aspect, excuse me. So will is in parentheses because you might not see will. However, there will always be either a form of to be, a form of to have, or both a form of to be and to have. And finally, a participle, okay? So, in the first example, the progressive aspect, okay, it's going to be any form to be, in the tense sense of the word, right? So it's not going to be a participle like being, right? It's going to be is, are, were, was, that sort of thing, plus the present participle, the ing form, and that's going to give you the progressive. So I am eating, I was eating, you were eating, so on and so forth. In the perfect aspect, it's essentially the same thing. However, rather than the form to be, we have the form of to have. Okay, so something like has, had, have, will have, that sort of thing. And this time, instead of the present participle, it's called, we use the past participle, okay? So I have eaten, I had walked, we had gone, that sort of thing. The last one, the perfect progressive aspect, could have the form of will, right, or could have will, and it's going to have a form of to have, so again, have, had, has, that sort of thing. The be form is there, however, the be form is always going to be been. Okay, so I had been, I have been, he has been, and this is with the present participle, okay? Now the question is, what do we do? What would happen if we changed some of these things? Okay, what would happen if we changed one of the participles or that sort of thing? So this gets us into a question of voice, okay? And voice, in the way I'm using it, refers to the relationship between the subject and the object. You have heard this talked about in probably all of your English classes in terms of active versus passive voice, okay? And passive is common in scientific writing because it gives an objective feel, okay? It assigns the subject an observer status. And it's not wrong, per se, but you have to be careful with it, right? If everything's in the passive, it can get a little bit boring. The cool thing is, the only thing we need to know to recognize the passive is we need to understand what happens, as I said, when we change a present participle to a past participle, or that sort of thing, when we're talking about aspect. In a sense, the passive is a way of, is kind of a mutant aspect, if you will. So what we can see from what I've written up, right, is we have the progressive aspect and we have the perfect progressive aspect, right? And so these are things that have the form to be, right, a form of to be, or been in the case of the perfect progressive, and a form of to have as well in the perfect progressive, with the present participle, okay? If we change the present participle to a past participle and add a preposition, by, we have created the passive voice. So for example, the progressive aspect would be I was eating. The passive voice would be I was eaten. The perfect progressive would be I have been eating. And the passive would be I have been eaten. As per usual, if you'd like to look at more on how to use these aspects and tenses and passive voice and that sort of thing, you can check out the Hacker Manual. She has a lot about, again, number and person, tense, mood, and passive voice.